I still remember the exact moment like a freeze frame in my mind. I was standing at the end of the long mahogany conference table, carefully placing a fresh set of acquisition documents into leather binders. The room smelled of polished wood, expensive cologne, and power. The CEO, Nathan Carlisle, the man who ran our multinational firm like his personal empire, leaned back in his chair, flashing that signature smug grin. "Mandy," he said, like my name was a punchline. "You're a secretary, not a lawyer. Maybe stick to stapling things, huh?" A few of the executives chuckled. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, but I said nothing. I simply nodded and set the binder down in front of him. I had been at Carlisle Holdings for 8 years. I started as an admin assistant, but over time I became something else entirely. The unofficial fixer. The quiet one in the room who remembered every clause, every date, every clause buried on page 47 of a 500-page contract. But none of that mattered to Nathan. In his eyes, I was furniture. Useful, silent, and invisible. The meeting was about the company's biggest acquisition yet, buying out a European logistics firm valued at $90 million. Everyone around the table was practically vibrating with excitement. The deal was set to close in a week, and Nathan, of course, would take all the credit. But as I handed him the contract draft for final review, I couldn't ignore the knot tightening in my chest. "There's something in here you might want legal to double-check," I said quietly, tapping a section near the back. Nathan barely glanced at it. I said, "Leave it." I looked him in the eye. "It's a loophole. Page 312, subsection D. It technically allows third-party purchase rights under dormant license clauses." Nathan scoffed loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Mandy, please, I have 3 Ivy League lawyers working on this. If they're not worried, I'm not worried. And I don't pay you to think." The room fell silent. Some smirked. Some looked away. I nodded again. "Understood, sir." But inside, something shifted. For years, I had accepted the condescending comments, the subtle digs, the glass ceiling pressed firmly against my head. I told myself it was the price of staying in the game. But this moment, this was different. This wasn't just arrogance, it was negligence, and I wasn't going to let it slide. That night, I stayed late at the office under the pretense of preparing meeting notes. The cleaning crew passed by without a second glance. After all, Mandy the secretary was always there, always invisible. But I wasn't preparing notes. I was reading, carefully, every clause, every footnote, every cross-reference of that acquisition contract. And what I found chilled me. The dormant license clause was real and legal. It allowed a third party to assume licensing rights if they paid a nominal fee and submitted a claim before the acquisition officially closed. The price? $1. It was a clause designed for emergencies, never meant to be triggered. But it hadn't been removed, and no one else had noticed. I stared at the legal print long after midnight. My hands trembled, but not with fear. With something sharper, stronger. For the first time, I realized the real power wasn't with the people at the boardroom table. It was with the people who understood the fine print. I made a decision that night. A decision that would change everything. But I wasn't reckless, and I wasn't naive. I knew I'd need a plan. And more importantly, timing. Because the clock on the acquisition was ticking. And Nathan Carlisle had no idea that by the time they tried to close their $90 million deal, I'd already be the legal owner of exactly what they were trying to buy. The next morning, the office hummed with its usual rhythm. Coffee brewing, keyboards clacking, small talk flowing like white noise. I sat at my desk outside the executive suite, reviewing emails. On the surface, I looked exactly like what they thought I was. The quiet secretary who didn't make waves. But under my blazer, folded neatly in my bag, sat a signed check for $1 and a printed claim form. I had called in a favor from an old college friend who worked in corporate compliance. She confirmed what I had read. The dormant license clause was binding. Absurd, yes, but binding. It had been left in the original acquisition papers from 20 years ago and carried over with every ownership change. And according to international trade law, if someone submitted a formal claim and payment before a merger's finalization, that person could assume the licensing rights of the company's core logistics software. Without that license, the acquisition would collapse. I wasn't a lawyer, but I didn't need to be. I just needed to follow the rules exactly as they were written. At 12:47 p.m., during lunch break, I walked to a nearby notary office. I signed the form, paid the filing fee, and submitted the claim. Legally, transparently, and with every document in order. I paid the $1 in cash. The notary, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, glanced at the figure and smirked. "Hope this works out for you," she said. I smiled back. "Me too." By the time I returned to the office, nothing seemed different. Nathan's assistant was gossiping with marketing. The CFO was on a call, laughing about golf. Nathan himself was barking at someone about synergy on the other side of the glass wall. I sat down and typed a brief summary of my filing, sending it to my personal email for safekeeping. The clock ticked. Nothing happened. For 2 days. I started to wonder if I had imagined it all, if maybe I had misunderstood some legal technicality. I had risked my job, my career, maybe even a lawsuit. But on the morning of the third day, I noticed a shift. At 9:15 a.m., a lawyer from the acquisition firm stormed into Nathan's office. They spoke in low, clipped tones. Nathan's voice rose once, a sharp bark, before dropping again. By noon, the legal team was huddled in the executive boardroom. At 1:30 p.m., Nathan summoned the entire leadership team for an urgent update. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. I heard enough as people whispered in hallways, snippets of conversations that floated my way. Some loophole claim? Who the hell filed it? The license is frozen. The deal can't close without it. I kept my head down, pretending not to listen. That afternoon, Nathan walked past my desk without looking at me. The man who had smirked at me 3 days earlier didn't smirk anymore. I went home that night with my heart pounding. Not out of fear. Out of something else. A strange mixture of disbelief and calm. It was working. But this wasn't over. Because I knew men like Nathan Carlisle didn't fold quietly. They fought. They bluffed. They crushed anything in their way. And I had just become a very inconvenient obstacle. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I even made it into the office. Nathan Carlisle, read the caller ID. I stared at the screen for a moment, thumb hovering over the answer button. Then I picked up. "Mandy," he said, voice sharp but coated with a thin layer of corporate politeness. "I need you in my office. Now." I smiled slightly, though he couldn't see it. "Of course, sir," I replied, my voice steady. As I walked through the office toward that glass door, I felt every gaze follow me. But this time, I didn't feel small. I felt ready. Because Nathan was about to realize. This was one corporate secretary who didn't just know the rules. I knew how to play them. And this game had only just begun. Nathan's office was colder than usual. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of the look on his face when I walked in. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the skyline like a general surveying a battlefield. I closed the door behind me. "Mandy," he said, finally turning. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Have a seat." I sat. He didn't. "I've been told," he began slowly, "that a dormant license claim has been filed against the Hanover acquisition." I said nothing. His jaw tightened. Imagine my surprise when I learned it was filed. By my secretary. I met his gaze, keeping my expression neutral. I followed the process outlined in the original contract. "It's a legal claim." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Legal or not, you had no right. You had no authority. You blindsided this company and jeopardized a $90 million acquisition." I kept my hands folded on my lap. "Actually, I exercised a public clause that your legal team overlooked. And as of now, I hold the licensing rights Hanover requires to operate in this market." His eyes darkened. "What are you playing at?" I blinked slowly. "Nothing, sir. I'm simply ensuring my rights as per the agreement terms. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched. Then, with a low chuckle, he circled behind his desk and sat down, folding his hands like a poker player about to raise the stakes. You want money? I tilted my head slightly. Excuse me? He gave a sharp smile. Come on, let's not pretend. You saw an opportunity to grab a piece of this deal. Fine. Name your price. I'll buy you out of this little stunt. Clean. Quiet. I held his gaze. I didn't file the claim for money. His smile faltered. Then what? I leaned forward slightly. I filed it because you dismissed me like I didn't exist. You made a choice to ignore my warning. The same way you've ignored every person who wasn't sitting at this table with a title you respect. I'm not here to negotiate, Nathan. I'm here because this isn't your game to win by default anymore. For the first time, his confidence wavered. You realize, he said slowly, that this will not end well for you. I nodded. I realize it won't end well for you either. We stared at each other in a silent standoff, the air between us razor sharp. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. You'll regret this, Mandy. I gave him a small, polite smile. I'll take my chances. I stood and walked to the door. His voice stopped me just as I reached for the handle. You think you're smarter than me? I turned, met his gaze head on. No, Nathan. I think I read the fine print. And then I left. The hours after our confrontation felt surreal. I returned to my desk, heart pounding, acting as if nothing had happened. The office was a sea of hushed voices and darting glances. Word travels fast in corporate halls, especially when a secretary walks into the CEO's office and comes out alive. By late afternoon, the company's legal team was scrambling. I overheard 2 junior associates whispering in the break room. They can't close the deal without the license. Who even filed it? I heard, Mandy. I kept walking, but I wasn't naive. I knew Nathan wouldn't let this go quietly. The first blow landed before I even left the building. At 5:03 p.m., an email popped up in my inbox. From HR. Subject, formal inquiry into conduct. Immediate response required. I opened it, my pulse steady. They were investigating me for unauthorized interference with corporate contractual agreements. I almost laughed. Almost. Because I had seen this tactic before. A classic move in corporate chess. Smear the opponent, discredit them, make them look like a rogue actor before they could build a defense. But I was ready. I forwarded the email to my attorney. Yes, I had hired one. 2 days ago. I wasn't walking into this unarmed. Nathan thought this was still his game. He hadn't realized yet. I'd already flipped the board. The HR inquiry wasn't a surprise. But what came next was. The next morning, I arrived at the office early, wanting to stay ahead of whatever Nathan had planned. The first thing I noticed was my computer. Locked. A red screen blinked back at me. Access restricted. Please contact IT. I took a slow breath. At 8:13 a.m., I got called into HR again. 2 people waited for me. One, the head of HR, and the other, a corporate counsel I had never seen before. We've temporarily suspended your system access, the HR director began, folding her hands neatly on the table. Pending investigation into recent concerns raised by the executive office. I nodded calmly. Concerns relating to a lawful, documented license claim that I filed personally, outside of company resources? A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. We're simply following protocol. I leaned back in my chair. So am I. I handed her a letter, signed by my attorney, formally stating that any retaliatory action taken against me, including restricting access or assigning blame without evidence, would be met with legal response. The counsel's lips pressed into a thin line as he read it. Is that a threat, Ms. Harris? I met his gaze evenly. Number, it's a fact. We sat in silence. Finally, HR nodded stiffly. We'll review this with our department. I left the office with no access to my system, but with something better: a paper trail. By noon, the whispers had grown louder. I caught fragments in the hallways. HR's on her now. She's finished. Crazy move. I walked past them all, keeping my expression neutral. I knew how this game worked. Nathan was trying to push me out before the board or shareholders got wind of what really happened. If I walked away now, it would confirm every accusation: unauthorized conduct, insubordination, breach of trust. But I wasn't walking away. At 2 p.m., I met with my attorney in a small cafe 2 blocks from the office. He was sharp, methodical, not one for theatrics. Exactly the kind of lawyer you want when facing a corporate machine. He slid a folder across the table. "We're filing a preemptive injunction. They move against you, they'll have to explain everything in court. Public record." I opened the folder, glancing over the documents. "Nathan won't risk that," I said quietly. My attorney smiled slightly. That's the point. The next day, the atmosphere at the office shifted. The tension didn't dissolve. It thickened. But this time, it wasn't directed at me. It was Nathan. Word had started leaking. People asked questions. How did a secretary file a binding claim? Why hadn't legal caught it? Why was HR scrambling like this? The CFO avoided eye contact with me. 2 VPs whispered in the hallway when I passed. And then, late that afternoon, something I didn't expect happened. I got a call from the chairman of the board. "Mandy, this is Richard Clark. I believe we need to have a conversation." I sat across from him in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor. Unlike Nathan, Richard didn't posture. He listened. For 20 minutes, I laid it all out. The ignored warning, the loophole, Nathan's dismissal, the filing, the retaliation. I presented everything with documents. Calm, factual, professional. When I finished, Richard sat back, hands steepled. "You've put us in a difficult position," he said finally. I met his eyes. "No, sir. Nathan did that. I followed the law. The company's leadership ignored it." He exhaled slowly, nodding. "You're not wrong." A pause stretched between us. "You've given us a lot to consider," he said. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak to the press in the meantime." I gave a small, polite smile. "I'm not looking for headlines, Mr. Clark. I'm looking for accountability." He nodded again, this time, slower. Understood. As I stood to leave, he said quietly, "We'll be in touch." By the time I left the building that night, the office felt like a cracked facade, still standing but ready to collapse. Nathan thought this was a game of intimidation. But he forgot one thing. You can't intimidate someone who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. By Monday morning, the office no longer felt like the same place. It wasn't anything obvious. No sudden announcements, no dramatic firings. But you could sense it in the air, in the clipped conversations, the nervous glances. The corporate ecosystem had shifted. Nathan wasn't holding court like usual. His glass office door, normally wide open, was closed, blinds drawn, and Richard Clark, the chairman, was on site. All morning, meetings shuffled, calendar invites changed. Executives were called upstairs for private discussions. HR kept their heads down. The legal department moved in and out of the boardroom like silent messengers. I watched it all from my desk, careful, quiet. By noon, rumors swirled. Emergency board review. Compliance breach. Carlisle's future in question. I didn't feed them. I didn't need to. Because this time, I wasn't part of the Whisper network. I was at the center of it. At 2:15 p.m., I got the call. "Boardroom, now." The voice belonged to Richard's assistant. I stood, smoothed my blazer, and walked the long corridor toward the executive suite. The glass walls reflected my image as I passed, calm, composed, exactly as I wanted to be seen. When I entered, every board member was seated. Nathan sat at the far end. His face was tight, jaw clenched, arms crossed over his chest. Richard gestured for me to sit across from him, one chair apart from Nathan. I nodded and took my seat. The room fell silent. Then Richard spoke. We've reviewed the documents Ms. Harris provided, along with statements from legal, HR, and compliance. We've also consulted with outside counsel. He looked around the table. A few heads nodded. This acquisition has been jeopardized by a critical oversight. That much is undeniable. The question before us now is how we handle both the business implications and the internal leadership issues that led us here. A murmur rippled through the board members. Richard turned to me. Ms. Harris, you filed a legal claim as a private individual using your own resources. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Were company resources used? No, sir. Did you act on proprietary information not available in public records? I shook my head. The clause I acted on was part of the original acquisition agreement, a public document, accessible through corporate filings. Richard nodded once. Thank you. He turned to Nathan. And you, Mr. Carlyle, were made aware of this potential issue prior to the claim being filed? Nathan's jaw tightened. Yes or no? Nathan's nostrils flared. Yes. Did you investigate the concern? Nathan hesitated, then muttered, I dismissed it. Silence fell again. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. Noted. The next hour was a controlled dismantling. They reviewed Nathan's mishandling of the deal, his refusal to escalate concerns, his attempt to retaliate through HR, and the formal complaint I had submitted through legal counsel. Every step Nathan had taken to discredit me was now evidence against him. He tried to defend himself. Excuses, half-truths, shifting blame to his legal team, even suggesting I acted out of spite. But the board wasn't buying it, and I didn't need to say much. The facts spoke louder than any defense I could have given. Finally, Richard delivered the verdict. Effective immediately, Nathan Carlyle is placed on administrative leave pending further review. The board will appoint interim leadership until a final decision is made regarding his position. Nathan opened his mouth, but Richard's raised hand silenced him. You may collect your personal belongings under supervision. Your access is revoked as of now. Nathan's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He shot me a look, not of anger, but disbelief. I met his eyes with steady calm. For once, he had no words. When the board adjourned, Richard pulled me aside. You handled yourself with professionalism and restraint, he said quietly. I respect that. Thank you, sir. He gave a small nod. We'll need your help navigating the fallout. Hanover's lawyers are already asking questions. I'll be ready. And I meant it, because this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about doing what Nathan never understood. Protecting the company by doing the right thing. The official announcement came 2 days later. Nathan Carlyle stepped down from his position as CEO, citing personal reasons. No press release, no farewell statement. Just a quiet internal memo that landed in everyone's inbox before 9 a.m., but no one believed it. The office buzzed with whispered versions of the same story. The board pushed him out. The acquisition nearly collapsed, and somehow, the secretary had been at the center of it all. I stayed silent. I wasn't interested in office gossip. What mattered was the deal. With Nathan gone, the Hanover acquisition moved forward, but this time, with full transparency. The board appointed Richard Clark as interim CEO. He insisted on a revised negotiation team, and to my surprise, he asked me to be part of it. Not as a token assistant, not as a silent note-taker, as a recognized advisor. You've proven you understand what's at stake, Richard said during our first strategy session, and you know better than most how to read between the lines. I accepted, with conditions. I wasn't going to be a figurehead. I wanted clear authority on compliance checks and contractual oversight. I wanted the autonomy to speak up without having to push through layers of bureaucracy. To my surprise, Richard agreed without hesitation. Consider it done, he said. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked side by side with the legal team, reviewing every inch of the acquisition paperwork. Hanover's attorneys were cautious but cooperative, especially after learning what had almost derailed the deal. When we finally closed the acquisition, it was airtight. No loopholes, no oversights, no ego-driven mistakes. The deal made headlines in industry circles, not because of its size, but because of the quiet shift in how it was handled. For once, a corporate giant closed a deal with integrity, and without burying its mistakes under layers of spin. One evening, after the final documents were signed, I found myself alone in the conference room, staring at the skyline. 8 years. 8 years of being underestimated, dismissed, overlooked. I had started this job thinking hard work alone would earn respect. I learned the hard way that it doesn't. Sometimes you have to take respect. Claim it. Stand firm when others expect you to fold. And most of all, you have to know your worth before anyone else will. Richard joined me a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of coffee. He offered me one. "You know," he said, settling into a chair across from me, "the board's been talking." I raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." He smiled faintly. "We want you to stay on, not just for compliance work. We're creating a new role, Director of Risk and Contract Strategy. Reports directly to the executive board." I blinked. "That's a real position?" He chuckled. "It is now." I exhaled slowly. "Why me?" His smile faded into something sincere. "Because you didn't just protect this company from a financial disaster. You protected it from itself. And you did it without seeking credit, revenge, or personal gain." I studied him for a moment. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded. "You earned it." The next morning, I moved into my new office. A modest space, no corner windows, no grand title on the door. And I was fine with that. Because this wasn't about a nameplate. It was about having a voice. And making sure no one else in this company ever had to fight alone just to be heard. As for Nathan, the last I heard, he took a consulting gig on the West Coast. A smaller firm. Fewer headlines. Maybe he'd learned something. Or maybe he hadn't. That wasn't my concern anymore. Some battles you fight for survival, some for principle. And some, you fight because walking away means accepting the way things are. When you know they should be better. I didn't set out to win a war. I just refused to lose quietly. And in the end, that made all the difference.